Holland. Half of its land has literally been reclaimed from the icy North Sea. It owes its very existence to massive barriers that have held back the raging sea for centuries. But now, Holland faces a new enemy. Climate change is driving the North Sea to record levels and pushing rivers over their banks. The Dutch are the undisputed masters at building dikes and huge moving barriers. Will engineers find a way to overcome this growing threat? Or could this be the end of 2,000 years of history, when the sea finally takes back what is hers? Perched on Europe's western coast is the Netherlands. 2 of its 11 provinces comprise the region of Holland. Holland and its neighbouring provinces have been locked in an epic struggle with the violent waters of the North Sea. The sea has made this region rich with abundant fisheries and access to the wealth of other lands. But the North Sea is also a constant threat. Holland's picturesque coastal farmland is well below sea level, but of equal concern, so are major cities like Amsterdam and Rotterdam, the busiest port in the world. Nearly half the country is in danger of being washed away. Holland's ultimate fate may lie in the hands of its engineers, who must decide where, when and how to engage the watery enemy.
We denken wel een heleboel na over hoe we de rivier...
We think a lot about extreme floods, and we try to protect ourselves against it. But we don't forget that whatever you build and whatever you construct, there always is a possibility of an even higher discharge or an even higher flood. So something still can go wrong. And the question that we're facing now is, can we somehow try to limit the damages that would occur in such an event?
Engineers have focused on critical places like the southern coast, where the world's longest dam with doors may stop the next devastating storm surge and save thousands of lives. And the mouth of the Rhine River, where engineers have designed the largest robot on the planet to stop the water in its tracks. But are these remarkable feats of engineering enough to keep Holland safe? Once they might have been, but today there's a new threat. Climate change on a global scale. Increasing temperatures across the planet have caused sea levels to rise, triggering vicious new storms that hammer coastal communities and sending mighty rivers rushing over their banks. Can any human effort to resist hope to prevail? Certainly, if anyone can make a stand against nature's fury, the Dutch can. They've been fighting and winning a war against the water that began 2,000 years ago. Dutch builders have had to fight for every piece of their territory, draining swamps and erecting dams. And their labours have paid off. Over the centuries, Holland has nearly doubled its original size, filling the swampy land that once stretched over 30 kilometres from the edge of the land to the coastal dunes. No one disputes the stubborn determination of the first settlers who drained this soggy land. The only mystery is why.
Je bent hier eigenlijk midden in de polder. This is how it all started. For some reason people came here and decided to settle down and start developing a society. I can't understand why they decided to stay here.
One reason for living on the swampy land must have been that the soil was extremely fertile. Holland's grounds are nourished by one of the world's mightiest rivers, the Rhine. Sweeping down from its source in the Alps, the river weaves nearly 1,500 kilometres before emptying into the North Sea. Along the way, the Rhine regularly floods the lowland, depositing nutrients into the soil and creating rich cropland. for anyone willing to do the hard work of draining it. The first settlers made their homes on small raised mounds near the seashore. Occasionally, the fertile land between the mounds flooded and cut off residents from one another. To protect the land, farmers eventually began to build primitive dikes, low walls designed to keep the tide out and keep the land dry. The early Dutch settlers called these reclaimed fields polders, and little by little the tiny settlement grew. But there was a problem. Over time, as the new land dried out, it settled, slowly sinking below sea level, making it impossible to drain off rain and seeping groundwater. Eventually, the water reclaimed the land. But over the centuries, advances in a remarkable technology began to turn the tide, literally, the windmill. These picturesque tourist attractions are actually sophisticated machines, the world's first large-scale wind-powered pumps. When covered with canvas, the mill's blades become sails that grab winds gusting in from the North Sea and convert them into pumping power through a series of huge gears that turn a massive water wheel below. By the 1600s, windmills were popular, offering the best solution to Holland's drainage problem. But there's a limit to how high a single windmill can lift the water. So engineers began to arrange the mills in groups over a network of canals, each pumping the water gradually upward, from the lowest point on the bottom land to the top of the dikes, where it spilled into a canal or river and flowed out to the sea. With the added power of wind, the Dutch could now steal vast tracts of new land from the sea, and modern Holland began to take shape. Today, the windmills have been replaced by modern diesel and electric pumps. Day in and day out, thousands of these pumps churn away, wringing the water out of Holland's soil, pumping 18 trillion litres per year, enough water to satisfy Tokyo's needs for nearly a decade. But Holland's success at draining and reclaiming the land would come at a heavy price. Banishing the sea from inland Holland was an incredible accomplishment. Every new farm, every prosperous house or soaring cathedral that appeared on the new land stood as a testament to Dutch ingenuity and resilience. But in a strange way, their very success exposed the Dutch people to an even greater danger. Because the faster the land was drained, the faster it sank. That has created a potentially disastrous situation for a country already dangerously below sea level. In the past century alone, Holland has sunk by half a metre. And in many Dutch canals and rivers, the surface of the water is as much as 6 metres higher than the land below. The only thing holding back the rivers and the sea are huge man-made dikes and natural coastal dunes. These are a constant concern to the millions of people who depend on them for survival. The Dutch understand all too well just what it would mean if one of these barriers were to fail. They have experienced it firsthand.
You can't describe it. There was, of course, an enormous damage. Everything you could see was water and dead cattle. It's really impossible to describe. It was like a war or something like that.
Over the centuries, floods have killed hundreds of thousands of people in Holland and reshaped the country overnight. The worst flood on record hit in the year 1287, when the North Sea surged across the dikes, protecting North Holland. Hundreds of people perished. That North Sea flood changed Holland forever, carving a brand new inlet, the Zuiderzee, deep into the country. On the banks of the Zuiderzee, the Dutch founded Amsterdam, which grew into a world-class trading and cultural centre. But floods plagued the new capital city. As recently as 1916, the North Sea surged into the Zuiderzee, smashing dikes and inundating thousands of homes just north of Amsterdam. With so much valuable property underwater and the city at stake, the Dutch authorities finally had enough. They decided to find a way to tame this angry arm of the North Sea. For help, they turned to a visionary engineer, Cornelius Lely. He proposed an audacious plan, Holland's first extreme engineering project of the modern era. He would slice the northern inlet in two with a structure of unheard-of size, a 30-kilometre-long dike across one of the most storm-racked stretches of water in the world. On one side would be the raging sea. On the other side, a new freshwater lake called the IJsselmeer. But could he do it? Or would Amsterdam one day succumb to a North Sea flood?
Absoluut een avontuur en vooral de afsluitdijk. Nobody really could guarantee that it would come to a successful end. It was actually a sort of dangerous project. So many people were involved, so many technique was involved, so many new techniques were involved.
In April 1927, Lely and his engineers began to construct the giant dike. It was the start of a massive national effort that touched the lives of every Dutch citizen. The plan was to erect a pair of clay walls, 90 meters apart. The trough running between them would be filled in during the final stages of construction. But the clay walls would have no chance of surviving unless they could be protected from the powerful North Sea tides. So thousands of workers wove a massive web of brushwood and willow branches. Workers assembled more than 1 million square meters of this protective covering, which would shield the sea floor and the sides of the dike itself from erosion. As the giant wooden web sank into position, workers anchored them in place with millions of tons of rock. With the clay walls secured, engineers began to pump 7 million cubic meters of sand into the gap, enough to form an artificial beach 100 meters wide, stretching 30 kilometers. As a final layer of armor, workers laid millions of tons of stone along the dike's outer walls. Finally, on May the 28th, 1932, 5 years after the project began, workers sealed the last gap in the dike.
De afsluitdijk is gesloten op 28 mei. We know exactly the time, 1 minute past 1 in the afternoon. It was really big news and many people had a proud feeling of the Dutch fighting the waves and succeeded again. That sort of feeling. Slecht in het voordeel van de Hollanders.
The Dutch had built the largest dike ever, a 30-kilometer-long wall that rose 3 meters above the high tide line. Cornelius Lely had scored a stunning victory for Holland against the North Sea. But he was not yet done. Behind the dam, in the new inland lake, he went on to build more dikes to enclose large portions of the old North Sea inlet. Then he sent in the pumps. Over the next 40 years, the Dutch drained over 2,000 square kilometers of ancient seabed, creating 4 new territories, the largest addition to Holland in history. As the waters receded, the seabed yielded up a treasure trove of artifacts from Holland's history, long hidden underwater, now in plain sight. Ancient shipwrecks and pottery. Even a 5,000-year-old skeleton. But it would take nearly a decade more for the land to dry out sufficiently to begin planting and building. The new northern closure dike stood as a shining triumph of engineering, and for the first time the Dutch felt safe from the constant threat of flooding. But 150 kilometers to the south, disaster was brewing in a marshy region where the Rhine splits into tiny branches before spilling into the North Sea. During World War II, Allied bombers had targeted this region to deny the Nazis an important strategic foothold. When the war ended, the dikes were in desperate need of repair. But they were the only barriers standing between the North Sea and some of Holland's oldest reclaimed lands. And then, on February the 1st, 1953, the unthinkable happened. A 130-kilometre-an-hour wind from the North Sea began to push a mountain of water towards the weakened dikes in the south. Pounded by 5-metre waves, the dikes eventually gave way. One village, Overkerk, was nearly wiped off the face of the earth. Because the first dike gave way after dark, most villagers had no way of knowing that the North Sea was upon them. The dikes had burst in 3 places. Trapped in their homes, many fled to their attics, but that was not high enough. Whole families were crushed or drowned as their houses collapsed. Nico Portvliet was one of the lucky few who survived.
My father, die was, slim. Father had his hammer and his chisel. So when we were in the top of the house, he could make a hole in the roof so that we could get outside. Because he said, we will be trapped just like rats. And that was just what happens with my grandmother a few houses away.
By daybreak, the sea had demolished 70 dikes and pushed nearly 75 kilometers inland. Nearly 2,000 people lost their lives. It took 10 months to repair the dikes and pump out the seawater. But for some, the memory of the tragedy endured far longer.
Ik denk dat het belangrijk is dat we toch people who made it through, they can say, no, remember, it can always happen again. Dat kan over 10, 20 jaar zijn en dan moet je er klaar voor zijn.
The disaster was a major setback for the Dutch. Clearly, the dike across the Zuiderzee was not sufficient to protect the country. Builders realized that they would have to construct another massive barrier, this time in the south. But there was a problem. The southern coast had not just one, but several inlets to protect, presenting an engineering challenge far more daunting than anything builders had ever faced. In 1958, engineers devised a plan and work began. Over the next 30 years, engineers painstakingly built barrier after barrier, creating new inland lakes and redirecting rivers. Finally, only one opening remained. But it was the largest inlet of them all, the Oosterschelde estuary. The tides here surge with incredible force. Even so, engineers pushed forward with a traditional dike, like the others they had just completed. But just as construction began, the project took an unexpected turn. For the first time ever, the Dutch public began to question the drastic reshaping of their environment. Building a dike across this inlet would have destroyed a fragile ecosystem, threatening the local fishing industry.
Het oorspronkelijke plan voor de Oosterschelde was...
There was a lot of public debate about whether or not we wanted that. It would change the environment from a saltwater environment to a freshwater environment, and the saltwater ecosystem would be lost.
In één klap de nek omdraaien.
So engineers stopped building and set out to try to find a new approach, one that would protect the land without decimating the coastal fishing industry. Spurred by these new demands, Dutch engineers came up with an ingenious proposal.
Een goed debat is gevoerd.
It was decided to build an open structure that would only be closed during extreme storm surges. And building in those hostile conditions, that was really difficult. At the same time, there was time pressure. So a lot of research and development had to take place during the construction phase even.
Tijdens de bouw.
It would be a dam like no other, because it wouldn't attempt to block the flow of water unless a devastating storm surge threatened the land. The proposed structure would be the world's longest dam with doors. More than 60 of them, each weighing as much as 40 fully loaded railroad freight cars, hung between 65 gargantuan piers. Under normal conditions, each door would remain open, allowing the North Sea to flow underneath. But if sea levels rose to dangerous heights during a storm, the doors would be lowered to the sea floor, sealing off inland Holland from the storm surge. No structure this complex had ever before been built in the sea, in an area with such strong tides. Builders feared that super strong currents would tear the structure apart before they could anchor it to the sea floor. The solution? Build the dam in sections, on land, then move the pieces into place in the sea. Could such an approach work? As engineers tested the components of the design, they encountered problems. How could they maneuver structures this massive across open water and place them with surgical precision, all the while battling the treacherous North Sea currents? In the end, they decided that their only option was to try. They began by creating 2 small islands in the inlet. On them, builders constructed factories and 2 huge dry docks to build the pieces of the dam. The islands also served another purpose. They narrowed the channel and reduced the length of the costly dam. But narrowing the channel had an unwelcome side effect. It made the tides run much faster because the same amount of water had to squeeze through a narrower space. Currents this strong made the sea bottom unstable.
Toen de Oosterscheldedam gebouwd werd,
Twice a day the water flows in and out at high velocity, and building a structure in there is quite a task. The bottom is formed of sediments, fine sediments that move around constantly.
dat was nogal een uitdaging.
To better understand how the current affects the sea floor, scientists came to a laboratory like this. A technician places a measuring device into a test tank. The bottom of the tank is lined with sediments, similar to those at the bottom of the North Sea inlet. When the water speed increases to that of the currents in the North Sea inlet, the sediments churn wildly. For Dutch designers, the lessons were clear. If they tried to build the dam directly on the floor of the inlet, the shifting sands would topple it. Could they devise another way of securing the massive dam? On Holland's southern coast, a gigantic new dike was underway, but the unstable seabed threatened to send the entire project back to the drawing board. Designers turned to the old Zuiderzee dike for inspiration. Here, the huge willow mats placed on the sides of the dam and the sea floor countered the force of the currents. Could a similar technique save the Oosterschelde Dam? Engineers believed it could, but this time they fabricated huge plastic mats, half a meter thick. The plastic foundation was then filled with gravel and covered with another plastic sheet. Meanwhile, shipyards launched 3 new construction vessels specially designed for the project. And in a huge dry dock created on the Channel Island, the massive piers took shape. Each pier was as tall as an 11-story building and weighed more than 16,000 tons. These colossal structures would have to be placed with great accuracy, and that would be a daunting task. The tides flowing into and out of the inlet are simply too powerful to make it possible. But there is a brief period each day when the current subsides, when the outgoing tide pauses before rushing back in. It was the narrowest of openings, a 30-minute window occurring only twice a day. If builders were to succeed, they knew they would have to move with clock-like precision. First, from the back of a ship, they unfurled the 30-meter-wide foundation mats, which came to rest on the unstable sea floor. Then another ship maneuvered one of the huge piers into position to lower it onto the waiting mat below. With only 30 minutes to complete the work, there was no room for error. Flood survivor Nico Portvliet took personal satisfaction in the construction of this project.
Moeilijkste werk wat we eigenlijk hadden bij het It's so difficult to place that right in the right place, just only a few centimeters away from the spot where it should be. And we were lucky we did it. En dat was een hele mooi werk.
A custom-designed scooping crane placed 4.5 million tons of rock around the edges of the dam to anchor the mats and brace the piers against any blow. Next came an equally demanding task, installing the huge doors, each weighing nearly 400 tons. By 1987, the storm surge barrier was complete. All 65 piers and their gates were in position, with a brand new highway running along the top. The most sophisticated dam ever built, its designers are confident it will last for 200 years. But can it really stand up to the full force of the North Sea?
When a big storm comes, you can imagine it's enormous, it's really enormous. When wind force 11 stands on the barrier with all the big waves up to 3 or 4 or even 5 meters, it's an enormous power. You really must feel it.
During a storm, computers monitor the rising seas. When a storm surge reaches 3 meters above median sea level, an alarm goes out to the emergency control team. They give the command to lower the doors, sealing off the inlet. As of 2002, the dam has had to slam shut 21 times, protecting the coast and saving countless lives. It's a victory for those who remember the terrible flood of 1953, like Nico Portvliet, the young village boy who grew up to be the current supervising engineer on the dam.
There is a kind of special feeling working on this barrier. You can imagine that.
With the completion of the southern barrier, Holland was better protected from the North Sea than ever. Yet there remained one glaring gap in Holland's formidable defences. The bustling city of Rotterdam was still an open target. Rotterdam, the busiest seaport in the world. Every 6 minutes, a ship enters or exits the harbour. Over a year, that's more than 80,000 vessels, hauling more than 300 million tons of cargo. If a major storm surge were to come barrelling up the Rhine, it would flood Rotterdam with 5 meters of water. Worse yet, the sea would inundate a huge area to the north, the most densely settled part of Holland, home to more than 5 million people. The Dutch knew they had to protect this strategic port, no matter what the cost. The problem was, no one could figure out how to design a storm barrier that wouldn't also restrict the flow of ships and goods. Most dikes use locks to allow ships to pass, but locks work too slowly to accommodate the crush of Rotterdam shipping traffic. And a dam with doors, like the one in the south, wouldn't work because the doors couldn't be raised high enough to allow ships to pass underneath. Without a new storm barrier, Rotterdam was exceedingly vulnerable. In 1991, a new generation of engineers took up the challenge to build a storm surge barrier large enough to protect the port in an emergency, but one that could be kept out of the way until needed. They came up with a revolutionary design, a pair of massive barriers that could swing into place across the river when needed, shielding the port from an approaching storm surge. Each barrier would be attached to the end of a massive arm of steel tubes. And each of these huge arms would have a shoulder, a ball and socket pivot that allows it to swing its barrier into place. To test the design, engineers experimented with a scale model in a lab. Like the model, the actual steel barriers would be hollow, allowing them to float on the surface of the water. Once they've swung into place, they will be filled with water and sink to the bottom, sealing off Rotterdam from the approaching flood. Overall, a stunningly simple design, but very difficult to build.
De eerste proeven die we in het laboratorium deden waren... The first test we did showed tremendous instabilities of the whole structure. Simply due to the current that's going under the barrier while we bring it into position. The barrier was absolutely out of control. Absoluut ongecontroleerd.
The slight bobbing motion of this scale model meant that the real barrier would heave up and down by as much as 10 meters, possibly tearing the structure apart. So engineers redesigned the underside of each barrier to try to reduce the turbulence. But no one could know for certain if this change would be enough. Finally, they were ready to begin building. First, they constructed a gigantic dry dock on each side of the river. The huge chambers mirrored the curved form of the barriers. Then, the giant steel tubes that would form the barrier's arms arrived. The largest tubes were 30 meters long and 2 meters in diameter, big enough for a person to stand up in. Welding each joint took 6 days and had to be perfect. A faulty weld on a structure weighing 13,000 tons would be catastrophic. Meanwhile, in a factory in the Czech Republic, workers cast the most critical components. The 2 steel spheres, each 10 meters in diameter, that would form the shoulder joints for the huge steel arms. Assembled from 8 sections, each 500-ton sphere had to be machined to an exact 1/50th of a millimeter, or the entire mechanism could jam. The finished spheres arrived by sea, suspended at the end of a massive crane. These ball and sockets are a remarkable feat of precise engineering. They are designed to function smoothly under the 65,000 tons of pressure that a powerful storm surge can generate. In 1997, after 6 years of construction and at a cost equivalent to $3 billion, the barrier was complete. Like a brigade of soldiers held in reserve, the giant gates wait in the wings until they are needed. Holland's Queen Beatrix christened the Maestland Barrier and witnessed its first full test run. The design worked perfectly, but this was on calm water. The real test will come the first time it has to close during a powerful storm. When that time comes, the barrier will move without human help. The barrier's computer systems continually assess environmental data and compare it with the barrier closure criteria.
All the machinery is started automatically by the computer, without any human interference. So in that sense, it's the largest robot.
Day in and day out, the barrier's computers stand watch over the waterway, analyzing the latest weather and oceanographic data, searching for an approaching storm. As of 2003, the barrier had not closed in an emergency. But that good luck may end one day. Because Holland's weather is changing. Storms are growing more vicious with each passing year. The raging North Sea has forced the southern dam to lower its doors 10 times more often than planners had originally predicted. And if the weather continues to worsen, intense storms like those found only in the tropics could make their way to Holland. The heavy rains they bring could turn once friendly rivers into deadly foes, opening a brand new front in the war on water. Hardest hit would be Holland's heartland, small farming villages like Ochten on the River Rhine. Floods have moved in and out with the seasons, tracing a predictable rhythm. For centuries, the dikes have protected the town and farmland during these floods. But in the winter of 1995, that pattern suddenly broke. Unusually heavy rains soaked the countryside. The water drained into the Rhine, causing it to rise. The river reached its usual peak level, but then it kept going.
De waterstand stond toen.
The level of the river was still here. The dike began to tear up. It was a very dangerous situation. I get the advice to evacuate immediately.
It was a critical moment. The swollen river threatened to overwhelm the dikes and flood the village.
There would have been a wall of water destroying all the houses in a circle of about a kilometer. That would have meant for the village of Ochten, of about 3,000 people, that it would have been washed away.
But the flood never came. The river stopped rising and slowly receded. Was this near miss nothing more than a once-in-a-century event? If global warming is a reality, it may be an indication of what is to come.
Our showers now will become more tropical, and that means that the tropical intensities will appear here. If you travel to the south, then you know that the tropical showers are way more intense than our showers in the north.
Will increased rainfall cause Holland to face a war on two fronts? Against both an angrier North Sea and flooding rivers? To learn what the future may bring, some Dutch planners have been studying a place closer to the tropics and a continent away, where engineers have been locked in a similar struggle. New Orleans, USA. This city is famous for its nightclubs and casinos, but the real gamble here plays for far higher stakes. The city is under siege from water on all sides, and engineers may be powerless to fend off disaster. Like much of Holland, New Orleans sits on land reclaimed from water, in this case, the Mississippi River. And also like Holland, the city has been sinking over the centuries. Not only that, nearby Lake Pontchartrain crowds New Orleans from the north. Only giant levees, similar to Holland's dikes, keep the city from being drowned. But New Orleans also faces a huge danger that Holland doesn't, at least not yet. Hurricanes. These enormous storm systems pack incredible power. Hurricanes gather strength far out to sea, and as they approach land, they drive a wall of water before them. These storm surges can be even more destructive than the North Sea floods in Holland. In fact, the largest storm surge ever recorded, a devastating wall of water 7 meters high, slammed into the Gulf Coast of the southern United States in 1969. Driven by the 280 km/h winds of Hurricane Camille, the storm surge killed 250 people in Mississippi. But it could have been much worse. When a Category 5 hurricane crashed into the Gulf Coast of the southern United States, the devastation was staggering. But the neighboring citizens of New Orleans considered themselves lucky. Had the hurricane veered just slightly to the west, it would have hit the city head-on. The storm would have first driven a wall of water from the Gulf of Mexico into Lake Pontchartrain, then scooped up the contents of the lake and heaved it over the levees onto the city below. It would have been a flood unlike any the city had seen before.
What I'm doing is using a surveying rod to illustrate how high the water would get during a Category 5 storm, or the worst case. Now, the top of the rod is 20 feet, and that's the elevation of the water we expect to see during a Category 5 storm.
A flood like this might claim the lives of up to 40,000 people. To prevent such a catastrophe, engineers know they need a barrier large enough to prevent the ocean from surging into Lake Pontchartrain during a hurricane. But none of the Dutch designs proved practical. Neither a massive dike nor a movable barrier. Because there are simply too many places for the water to force itself in.
We have to understand what's happening in the environment, because we cannot out-engineer such things as hurricanes. They're just too big.
But engineers realized that nature itself might provide the solution, by way of the Mississippi River. Each day, the river dumps 2.5 billion liters of water into the Gulf of Mexico. With that water flows thousands of tons of sediment, clearly visible from space as a reddish-purple halo at the river's mouth. If engineers could let the Mississippi carry some of that mud into the swamps that border the lake, the river might gradually build up a natural surge barrier, far larger than any man-made structure. The plan signals a remarkable change of heart as engineers release the river to flood some of the land. It's a lesson for Holland, where rivers might be the key to fending off future disaster. That scenario might look something like this. The year is 2050, and tropical-strength storms, spawn of global warming, now routinely hammer northern Europe. After weeks of rain, the Rhine is already swollen and runoff is gushing into the North Sea. Then, the unimaginable. A second massive storm, as strong as a Category 5 hurricane, approaches Holland from the North Sea, driving a wall of water ahead of it. Word goes out to close the Southern Barrier Dam. Emergency crews at the Zuiderzee Dam anxiously monitor the mounting storm surge. The Maesland Barrier's gigantic arms swing into place. Hour after hour, the storm surge grows, but the barriers hold. It begins to seem that Holland will escape unscathed. But then the news along the Rhine takes a chilling turn. The river is rising, rapidly. The dikes give way at a dozen places, and hundreds of communities are flooded. Engineers are out of options. They have no way to hold back the water. So they make a fateful decision. For the first time in more than 2,000 years, they surrender. They cut their losses and relinquish some of the land. They won't try to fight the flood. Instead, they will try to manage it. They will divert the rivers away from the most densely settled areas, allowing the water to spill into farmland. The cost will be high, but by allowing some areas to flood, they will preserve much of their hard-won land and save lives. To prepare for the future, engineers are already marking some areas as potential floodplains. In the war on water, it's a tactical retreat, but not a defeat. Because for the Dutch, the water is both foe and friend, and they owe their history to the struggle for balance between the two.